Welcome to the latest episode of the Real World Nutrition Podcast. This is episode 207, Sodium and Balance, Understanding Salt in Everyday Nutrition. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Real World Nutrition Podcast. I'm glad you're listening today because I want to address one of those nutrition topics that tends to stir up a lot of confusion and, believe it or not, strong opinions, and that is salt, or more specifically, sodium. Now, this episode is a compliment to a blog I recently wrote called Salt, Why Your Body Needs It, But Not Too Much. I'll link that blog in the show notes as I usually do, and if you want to get a little bit deeper into the reading side of things, that's where you want to go. But here, I'm going to talk about the salt, sodium, as I said, break it down into some practical everyday terms here, and hopefully get some clarity or give you some clarity on this. And let's be honest here, salt is everywhere. It's in our food, it's in our kitchens, it's on the restaurant menus, whether it's spelled out on it or not. And it often comes up in conversations about health and even sports nutrition. And looking at this topic, or my experience with this topic, some people think salt is an evil ingredient that we have to avoid at all costs, while others just go liberally all over with salt all over their food without giving it a second thought. And as with most things in nutrition, the truth is somewhere in the middle. So today I want to talk about sodium, salt, and balance in real-world nutrition in our daily lives. So I'll cover what sodium actually does in the body, why we cannot live without it, where most of it comes from in the diet. Most people are surprised by this, how too much impacts our health, and how to find the balance without swinging to the extremes. So first up, what is sodium and how is it different from salt? Now, I want to make this clear. There is a distinction. I do often use these terms interchangeably. I try to be clear about which one I'm talking about, but let's talk about this. Sodium is a mineral. If you look on the periodic table, it is there, Na, and it's an electrolyte that keeps the body running properly. We need it. Salt, on the other hand, is sodium chloride. So the table salt a lot of us are familiar with, or any type of salt we use in cooking, is sodium chloride. And that means, or that is, I should say, about 40% sodium, 60% chloride. So chloride is something else you will find on the periodic table. So those two things together are the salt most of us are familiar with. So when you're sprinkling that table salt on your food, you're adding sodium, but not just sodium. You're adding chloride too. Now here's where the confusion comes in. When the guidelines or food labels talk about sodium, they're not talking about salt in general, but the sodium part of it. So that's why food labels list sodium rather than salt, because there are foods that naturally contain sodium in it without people adding salt. And it's actually impossible to not have sodium in our diet because it's going to be found in foods no matter what you're eating. When I have high fruits and vegetable intake, I'm still getting sodium. It's just not a lot. And just like with dietary fats versus body fat, there's difference between the dietary sodium or the sodium you eat and the sodium that's already working inside your body. So, of course, dietary sodium comes in through the food while our body uses that sodium in the bloodstream, in the tissues, and keeps things in balance. Now, first up, why do we need sodium? Sodium is essential. It's one of our essential minerals. We must get it from food. And without it, the body wouldn't function. So sodium is part of regulating fluid balance along with some other electrolytes. And that fluid balance, we've got fluid that's inside our cells, some that's outside our cells, and what we call interstitial fluid. And we want that to be in a very specific balance. Now, luckily, we don't have to think about this. The body tends to take care of it on its own and finds that balance with the various electrolytes. So when we're out of balance, that could be our cells are getting too much water inside the cells or not enough inside the cells. Also, sodium is critical for nerve function and muscle contraction. So every time you move, your muscles rely on sodium to contract properly. Every time your heart beats, sodium is part of that process. I want to clarify, sodium is a part of that process. It is not the only thing involved in that process. So that's why if somebody has really low sodium levels, really low sodium levels in the blood, something we call hyponatremia. So as I said earlier, that salt on the periodic table is Na, and hypo means low. So hyponatremia is low sodium, low blood sodium. That actually can be very dangerous. And symptoms can range from headaches and nausea to confusion, seizures, and in severe cases, this can happen, even death. So when our blood sodium levels get too low, it can lead to death. Now, I want to make this clear. Most people aren't hyponatremic on the regular. It takes a lot of excess fluid or something else is going on for that to happen. So sometimes people hear about hyponatremia and start thinking they need to add salt to everything, which is not what we need to do. And honestly, a true sodium deficiency from diet alone is rare. Most people get more than enough. That's again where I said the bigger concern is the other end of the spectrum, too much. Now, let me give some specific examples of when hyponatremia can occur. So in endurance activities, so physical activities that are hours long, people are sweating but not replacing sodium. They're just replacing water without the sodium. That can lead to hyponatremia. There's been times where people drink a lot of plain water in a very short period of time. We're talking 4 bottles or 2 liters within 20 minutes. That can be hyponatremia. So again, we don't want to go to extremes here. And hyponatremia can be managed pretty quickly in most cases by just having some salt. I had this one time, I had half a fried chicken sandwich and I was fine within about 10 minutes. So I want to make that clear. So now, how much sodium is too much? So here's where some of those numbers come in. Dietary guidelines for Americans and many other health organizations like the American Heart Association recommends less than 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day for adults. Now, let's put this in perspective. That's about 1 teaspoon of salt. So if you have 1 teaspoon of salt, remember I said that's 60% chloride, 40% sodium. 1 teaspoon is 2,340 milligrams. So that's really not a lot when you really think about it. But here's the kicker. The average American eats closer to 3,400 milligrams per day, and sometimes a lot more. I've seen people who are far above 6,000 milligrams a day, 8,000 milligrams a day. These are college students. Granted, they tend to have highly processed foods. This is based on my experiences. So again, that's way above the recommended level, even for people who are pretty healthy. And this is not because people are shaking the salt shaker too much. In fact, when people I work with and the students I work with are entering their food information into their diet analysis program, I've never seen a student add salt from the salt shaker into their analysis. So all that sodium is coming from that food they're eating. And in fact, only about 10% of our sodium intake comes from the salt shaker. So when people say, I need to cut back on my salt by not using table salt as much, that's really not the biggest source for most people. The vast majority, over 70% of our sodium intake, comes from processed foods and restaurant meals. So the sodium issue is less about how much you're sprinkling at the table or grinding at the table, and more about the types of foods that we tend to rely on every day. So where does most of the sodium come from? So I did mention the processed foods and restaurant foods. So let's look deeper into some of these common culprits here. Packaged foods and processed foods are huge contributors. So things like canned soups, frozen meals, snack foods, deli meats, breads, and sauces have sodium in them, and some of them can be pretty high. Even foods that don't taste particularly salty can add up. So bread is a great example, and even some of those ready-to-eat cereals can be a significant source of sodium. So in talking about a slice of bread may only have 100 to 150 milligrams of sodium. And if you've ever had low sodium or no salt bread, it does not taste good. So even that small amount provides some flavor there. But if you're eating multiple slices a day, it can add up fast. And here's the other big one, restaurant meals. Chain restaurants, fast foods, even sit-down places tend to use a lot of salt in cooking. And it boosts flavor. It also preserves and helps with extending shelf life of ingredients. In some restaurants, too, they have a lot of salty things, so it encourages you to drink more. That's a marketing thing. But a single restaurant entree can easily pack over 1,000 milligrams of sodium, sometimes even 2,000, but even more often, it can be at least a day's worth, if not 2 or 3 days worth in a single meal. And I've seen on menus with items where a single item has over 5,000 milligrams of sodium, and once I even saw one that was over 9,000 milligrams. But I want to make it clear that was an entree that I would refer to as an extreme entree anyway. So it was like triple cheeseburger with onion strings and bacon and high salt already. So overall, the meal wasn't going to be healthy regardless of how much salt was in it. So it's not about the salty snack here or there. It's the pattern of eating foods that are already loaded with sodium before you even touch the salt shaker. And I want to also make a point of clarification is a lot of companies have been actively, working on lowering the sodium of their food products over the course of years. And if it goes too low, sometimes people won't eat it or won't like it. So there's still have to be a balance there. And you can always choose not to purchase those foods. So yeah, food manufacturers are going to use it, but we can't put all the blame on them. We are the ones that are still buying that food. Now, let's talk about the health impact of too much sodium. Most people are aware of this, but when we have our sodium intake consistently high, the biggest concern is high blood pressure or hypertension. So back to that fluid balance. Sodium pulls water into the bloodstream, and that increases our blood volume. And the blood volume going higher means more pressure against the walls of your arteries. And over time, that can damage those vessels and increase the risk of heart disease, stroke, and kidney problems. Now, I want to make this clear. Not everyone is equally sensitive to sodium, though. Some people can eat a higher sodium diet without much impact on their blood pressure, while others will see a significant impact. So genetics, age, race or ethnicity, and overall health do play a role in how sodium affects blood pressure. Still, across the board, reducing high sodium intake, reducing our sodium levels, again, from food, tends to help. But I also want to clarify, I think I've said this in past episodes, I don't recall which one. It's not the sodium that's too high, it's the sodium that's too high, as well as not getting enough potassium, which helps with fluid balance and blood pressure. Back to the sodium. It's not just the blood pressure. High sodium can take a toll on our kidneys. It can contribute to fluid retention, and in some cases can worsen bone health by increasing calcium loss in the urine. So the effects are more widespread than just salt and high blood pressure. And I have had people ask me if they should add more sodium or salt to their diet if they have low blood pressure, to which I don't usually recommend that unless they've been specifically prescribed to do so by their primary care provider, because most people get plenty of sodium, as I've already mentioned. So if it would help people who have low blood pressure to get better blood pressure or more, quote, normal blood pressure, it probably would have already had an impact by now. So that's not saying because you have low blood pressure, it's a free-for-all to add salt to everything or have a high salt foods. Again, we want to make sure that's on a case-by-case basis. Some people may have a prescription or be prescribed to have more sodium. It does happen on occasion. It's just very, very specific. Now, I want to address some myths and misconceptions because I have to address myths and misconceptions. Because sodium gets unfairly demonized at times, people hear that too much sodium is bad, and then this idea is that we have to get rid of all of it, aim for no sodium. And that's not true. So remember, sodium is essential. We cannot live without it. And this idea that you should completely cut out salt is really not realistic. If somebody is prescribed a 1,500 milligram sodium diet, it's really, really, really hard to get there. If your diet is mostly fresh, whole foods, vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and you season with some cooking, or season with some salt when you're cooking, you're usually fine. You're probably fine. The problem isn't, again, it probably isn't that pinch of salt in the homemade soup. It's the ultra-processed packaged soups that would already contain 800 milligrams per serving. And let's just say, again, working with college students, a classic soup that people go to is hands down one of the highest sodium foods that we find at the grocery store. And then another misconception, I love this one, is that certain types of salt, like sea salt, Himalayan pink sea salt, or other gourmet variety of salts, are somehow healthier because they're natural. Well, salt is natural anyway, regardless of which form it is in. And the reality is, gram for gram, they all contain the same amount of sodium. It's not healthier. And they might have trace minerals. That's what makes them have those colors. But those minerals aren't in enough amount to make a meaningful health difference. You would have to have so much of that salt to get measurable amounts of those minerals that the damage the excess salt would do is more significant than any benefit from those minerals. So let's get some practical strategies for balance. What does this look like? Well, first up, read food labels. Take a look at the sodium content per serving and be mindful of how many servings you're actually eating. A good one here, cook more at home. That way you control how much salt goes into your meals. Use herbs, spices, and an acid, so garlic, onion, black pepper, paprika, citrus juice like lemon or lime juice, and vinegar can flavor greatly without sodium. Here's another place where salt comes in, or sodium comes in that people don't tend to think of. Well, soy sauce. Even low sodium soy sauce, which is what I've used exclusively for years, is still very high. I should say it's reduced sodium soy sauce, not low sodium. Ketchup, salad dressing, sauces can add up, so it all adds up. Juice fresh when possible, so fresh or frozen fruits. Vegetables are naturally low in sodium, but if you buy canned, look for the no salt added. So I buy the no salt added beans and tomatoes and that sort of thing. And with beans, I rinse them before I use them. So if it makes sense to rinse before you use it, canned food, do that. It can reduce the sodium upwards of 50%. And then find balance with restaurant meals. If you know you're going to eat out, aim for lower sodium choices throughout the day outside of that meal. So the point is, again, not to cut out sodium completely, is to be aware of where it comes from and adjust so you're not consistently overdoing it. I also want to make note, when people gradually lower their sodium intake, their taste buds do naturally adapt over time. So be persistent. So when low sodium matters, when will this be an important thing? There are times when a lower sodium diet is especially important. So I've mentioned some of these already. People with hypertension or high blood pressure, kidney disease, or certain heart conditions, they're often advised to reduce sodium more strictly. That's a case-by-case basis. And then also mentioned athletes or people who sweat a lot might need more sodium, especially in hot conditions. So that's why sports drinks contain electrolytes, including sodium. But for the average person, plain water and a balanced diet are usually enough to replenish what is lost through sweat. All right, so finding the middle ground. At the end of the day, it's all about balance. I know you're shocked. I don't talk about this enough, do I? Too little is dangerous, too much can be harmful, and the sweet spot is somewhere in between. So for most people, paying attention to processed foods and restaurant foods, so again, paying attention to how much, not necessarily eliminating it, seasoning home-cooked meals with intention, these are the real solutions. So if you're wondering, do I need to throw out my salt shaker? Well, no, don't be ridiculous. You do want to still use it if you're cooking. It's worth looking at the bigger picture of your diet. Where is the majority of your sodium coming from? And that's where you can check labels. It's required to be listed there. And if you want, you can track for a week and see how you're doing or where it comes from. I don't think everybody needs to do that. Just be aware of it. Okay, with that wraps up today's episode of Real World Nutrition. If you want to read more, again, check out the blog I've linked in the show notes, Salt, Why Your Body Needs It, but Not Too Much. And as always, thanks for tuning in this week. I will be back with another episode next Friday. So you take care and bye for now.